I heard that the millennials, my generation, destroyed this thing that I had when I was growing up. The china cabinet. Y'all know what I'm talking about? When I was growing up, my mom had 2 sets of dishes. She had 3 because she had 2 special ones, right? We had the normal dishes that we all ate off of. And they were in the kitchen, and they didn't match, and they didn't make sense. And we had some were circles like normal plates are. We had plates that were rectangles that had cool little cup holders built into the plate, right? You had all these mismatched dishes, and the cups that were in the kitchen, some were plastic, some were metal. None of them were glass, right? You had all the common stuff that we ate and we drank off of all the time. And then in the dining room, there's the special cabinet with the special dishes that you get to look at with your eyes. But you never touch, right? Those were the ones that you never ever touched. They were there in the dining room, and you got to look at those dishes. My mom had 2 sets. She also collected Fiesta ware, which sat in another thing in the other room, and you didn't touch those either. Certain one of those were old enough that they were collector's items. No joke, some of that was made in the wrong factory in Mexico, and it was, there was like uranium near the factory. So we took it to high school once, and we got it tested, and yes, it was radioactive, no joke. But anyways, we had all that, like that special china that no one was allowed to touch. And I remember one time, I don't know what inspired me, but I went into the dining room, opened up, got the fine china out, I placed my hot dog on it, and I put it in the microwave and clicked start. And wouldn't you know, that gold-rimmed china just started sparking like crazy, and I was in deep trouble. The reality is that we had this dishware, this china, that we weren't supposed to use. The reality was it came out like every other year. And when it came out, it marked that something special was happening. This is Christmas. This is a time that is set apart. This is a significant family moment right here that we're having. And we knew it was significant because the china had come out. We've been working our way through the book of Daniel, talking about this theme of unwavering, what it means to be steady, what it means to be consistent time and time again in our journey with Jesus. And this week we are going to talk about this idea of unwavering holiness before the Lord. The first 4 chapters that we've read in Daniel, the crew, you're starting to get used to them. We've got King Nebuchadnezzar, and then we've got Daniel and his 3 buddies. Today, that's all going to kind of get shoved off to the side. King Nebuchadnezzar is no more. And if you open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 5, we're going to kind of go from verse 1 through the end. But the first words that you'll read are King Belshazzar. And you might be wondering, who is this? Wasn't there last week? King Belshazzar. For the first 4 chapters, we had King Nebuchadnezzar. So who is this guy? Historians reveal that Belshazzar, unlike what we might believe when we first read the text, isn't a king at all. There have been 3 kings that followed Nebuchadnezzar. They all had pretty short reigns of just a few years. It's been maybe a decade since King Nebuchadnezzar has ruled, and we have this King Belshazzar. The reality is that King Belshazzar has a father. His name is Nabonidus. And Belshazzar himself has chased his father, who actually is king, out into the wilderness of Saudi Arabia. And his father is living in a tent. And Belshazzar is living in the capital city of Babylon. And he's not officially the king, but he is the one living like a king and calling the shots that the king would call. And so verse 1, it says, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. This is likely a banquet that is intended to rally the troops. It's going to be all the high-ranking military officials. See, Babylon was on the run. Babylon was being invaded by the Medes and the Persians. In fact, the town or the village where Nabonidus, Belshazzar's father, had set up his tent in Saudi Arabia, it had been conquered. They had been pushed back. The territory that makes up the Babylonian Empire is shrinking every day. And so this is likely a banquet intended to rally the troops because Belshazzar knows an attack is coming. So this might be a banquet intending to encourage the leaders, like, take courage, you guys can do this. It might have been a banquet to maybe provide distraction, like, hey, we're going to have a feast and we're going to quit thinking about how we're getting our tails kicked on the battlefield. Maybe it was a feast of, hey, feast tonight, for tomorrow we die, kind of a thing. Maybe it's a little bit of all three, but the reality is tension is filling the air. They know that their demise may certainly be on its way. Verse 2, while Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles and his wife and his concubines drank from them. So they picked out, if you remember, all the way back in Daniel chapter 1, we talked about this. It's mentioned in the first chapter that when King Nebuchadnezzar conquered Judah, he took out all of the holy things out of the temple, including these goblets that we're talking about here. The question is, why does Belshazzar choose to get them out on this night? It's been 10 years. There's no mention in the biblical text, and it certainly would seem to be an important biblical moment if one of the kings had brought these out. There's no mention of it until now. They probably didn't run out of the everyday cups. They probably had plenty of their own to use. Likely, Belshazzar is making a statement. And there's two statements to be had here. The first is this: Nebuchadnezzar is the only one who's ever touched these cups before. Nebuchadnezzar is the one who conquered and went to Jerusalem and took these holy things away. And while Belshazzar is pushing his father outside of the city, there's in some sense in which him grabbing these holy goblets could be him saying, I am like that guy. I am like Nebuchadnezzar. I get to use the things that even he wouldn't use. And the other problem is this. The other statement he might be making is that there were these guys hanging around in Babylon, names like Daniel and Isaiah, Old Testament prophets, who were prophesying and who were saying negative things about Babylon, including declaring that Babylon would fall. And so there's a sense in which Belshazzar may have been saying, hey, I don't care what you have to say about me. I'll spit in your face and I will spit in the face of your God. So Belshazzar breaks out the holy goblets that had been taken out of the temple in Jerusalem. In verse 4, as they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. And then suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall, near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak, and his knees were knocking. So Belshazzar sees this writing on the wall, and this begins a sequence that's going to be very familiar from what we saw in Daniel chapters 2 through 4. Belshazzar, much like we've seen before, he goes and he finds the fortune tellers and says, hey, come here, come tell me what this means. They get there and they say, we can't, we have no idea what this means, what's written on the wall, we have no idea what it means. And then we're introduced to a new figure that we haven't met so far, again, in the book of Daniel. And it's the queen. No introduction to her, and we don't have an exact identification of who this was. In that point in time in Babylon, it would have been common for the queen not to have been the wife of the king, but actually to have been the mother of the king. And so there's some questions. This could be Belshazzar's mother, but we think she's off with Nabonidus, living in a tent somewhere, getting chased around the desert. This could be Nabonidus' mother. She would certainly have the right to have that role or title of queen. And then also when we look at what she's about to say, there's some sense, it's only been 10 years since Nebuchadnezzar died. There's some sense in which this could be Nebuchadnezzar's wife or even Nebuchadnezzar's mother, still hanging around the royal palace, still handing out wisdom to those who will listen. In verse 10, the queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall and said, "May the king live forever. Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners." And so we had the same sequence unfold again. They don't know what to do. They call the fortune tellers. The fortune tellers can't tell them what to do, and so they call on Daniel, and Daniel comes into the scene to give them a response. In verse 17, Daniel answers the king. The king's offered him a reward, and Daniel says, "You may keep your gifts to yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means." So for whatever reason, Daniel's here. He's ready. In the past, he's actually accepted the king Nebuchadnezzar's rewards. This time he says, "No, I'm not going to accept your rewards." This could be for a few different reasons. One, if we go back and carefully study the passage before this, there's some few subtle jabs that King Belshazzar throws Daniel's way. It could be that Daniel says, "I don't work for you, the king. I work for the Lord my God, and therefore I'm not going to accept your rewards." Daniel also knows, because he knows what the writing on the wall means, that the king's reign will come to an end soon. And so maybe there's simply some wisdom here that says, I don't want to be associated with the royal palace of the king who's about to be dethroned, because it may cost me my life too. But here's how Daniel responds. Verse 18. "Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor." Notice he calls him your father. There's this weird link, even though Nebuchadnezzar isn't his biological father, but he's going to call him his father. Like there's this lineage of kings that Belshazzar wants to be associated with. "But God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty, greatness, glory, and splendor. And because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those that he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. And he lived with the wild animals and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged the Most High God as sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes." So we get this recap of what Daniel saw in Nebuchadnezzar and what Belshazzar should have seen in Nebuchadnezzar. And then he goes on, "But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, even though you knew all of this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his holy temple brought to you. You and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank from them." So when Nebuchadnezzar had offended the Lord because of his lack of humility, Belshazzar lacks humility, and he takes it a step further by violating the holy objects that Belshazzar had taken. He uses them himself. These are holy objects made for a holy purpose in the temple. And Belshazzar uses them in unholy, in the everyday of I'm having a party for my nobles, and to make it worse, a party where they are going to worship idols. This is a theme throughout the Old Testament. What the Lord does with the temple is holy. Everything that is to be made for the temple is holy. The temple itself is holy. It is where God's presence resides. And so the Lord cares deeply about how his people interact with the temple and interact with the things that belong in the temple. When you think of stories, Leviticus chapter 10, Nadab and Abihu offer unauthorized fire, and they're struck dead. 2 Samuel 6, Uzzah touches the ark, seemingly to try to keep the thing from hitting the ground. He falls dead. 1 Samuel 5 and 6 is one of my favorite Old Testament stories. But the Philistines, they take the ark away from the people of Israel. And they put it in their own temple to their own God. And they wake up in the morning and they find that their God, made of bronze, is laying down on the floor at the feet of the ark. They take their God, they pick him back up, set him upright. The next morning they wake up, and this time he's fallen down on the floor and he's broken into pieces right there before the ark. They still don't get the point. They end up having tumors go over all their bodies until they finally decide, we're going to get it out. And when they get it out, they recognize they can't touch it. They put it on a cart, have some cattle take it, and they don't even walk with the cattle. They just say, yeah, go ahead, take it back. And it goes right back to the people of Israel where it belongs. There's this way in the Old Testament in which the temple represents the holiness of God. And the temple itself and the things that go in it are to be revered. Our story continues in verse 24. Therefore, this is still Daniel speaking, he, referring to God, sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that is written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. The literal meaning of these words is mina, shekel and a half. We're talking about coins. It's talking about currency. So for our modern day context, it might be dime, nickel and a half. These would have been words, this is Aramaic that this hand is inscribing in, words that everybody who's at the party can read. The king can read these words, the nobles can read these words, the fortune tellers that come and were asked what these words mean, they can read the words. The problem isn't that the words are in a language they can't read. The problem is they don't know how to interpret what they might mean. And so Daniel, who we've seen twice already in this book, go to the Lord, and the Lord answers Daniel's prayer, and the Lord gives him understanding of visions and dreams. We understand here that the Lord is giving Daniel some understanding of what these words might mean. And Daniel does a little wordplay. I think some inspired by the Lord wordplay. And we get these words that are almost homonyms. They're almost homonyms. They sound similar to the words written on the wall, but instead of being nouns about currency, become verbs that have something to say about Belshazzar and his reign. So verse 26, Daniel speaks. He says, here is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Numbered being the word that comes from Mene. Tekel, you have been weighed. Weighed being the word that pulls out there. You've been weighed on the scales and found wanting. And Paris, your kingdom is divided. Divided being the word written on the wall. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. And as this happens, God's plan to take care of his people, to answer their prayers, is coming about. As Darius conquers, Darius is going to give way to Cyrus, and Cyrus will be the one who makes the mandate that the people of Israel can return home and rebuild the temple. God is at work throughout this entire story. Let's go back to those goblets, those holy goblets for just a minute. Those goblets weren't to be put away, never to be used. These were goblets from the temple. They had purpose. They were to be used, and they were to be used regularly for temple purposes. The problem isn't that Belshazzar got the goblets out. The problem is that Belshazzar wasn't using the temple things for temple purposes. We don't have any holy goblets laying around here at Connection as far as I know. So the point of this passage isn't don't play with the holy goblets. They're not under lock and key somewhere in the basement. As far as I know. If anybody knows, let me know. So what are we supposed to get out of this teaching? Dave read from 1 Corinthians this morning, chapter 3. I'm going to reread 16 and 17. They say this, "Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person, for God's temple is sacred, and you together are that temple." This isn't a you in the singular are that temple, although Paul will make that argument in 1 Corinthians 6. But what Paul is saying here is that we, this collective body, the church, is God's temple. That what we have right here in this room, not the building, not the programs, but what we have in this room is something sacred and holy before the Lord. You yourselves are God's temple. The temple declared the glory and the majesty of God to both the Jews and the Gentiles. This body is to declare the majesty of who God is. The temple was filled with and mediated the presence of the Lord. This place is to be filled with, Paul says it himself, God's Spirit dwells in your midst. And the temple served as a place for ritual cleansings and for sacrifices to forgive sins. It's the place where God's people are made right with God. And this is a place where we discover the good news of Jesus and his grace, where we find forgiveness of sins, where we find freedom from sin, and where we lead other people to the same. But the command is this in the verse. Don't destroy God's temple. If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person, for God's temple is sacred, and you together are that temple. You together are that temple. That Jesus is building his church, that he's building something special and something holy, something that is set apart for his purposes. And Paul is giving us the warning, do not destroy the temple, not the building, but this temple, this body that the Lord has created. If you read through this chapter in 1 Corinthians, you'll see that the concern that Paul has is that of division. Some people are saying, hey, I follow Paul. He's my leader. Others are saying, I follow this other guy. We don't know him as well, but his name is Apollos, and he's my leader. And Paul is coming to them and saying, you are divided, and because you are divided, you are on the verge of being people who destroy this temple that the Lord has created. You are on the verge of destroying this body if you remain divided. But how silly is it that you would be divided over this leader or that leader when all of us should be looking to the Lord Jesus Christ as our one true leader? The Paul and Apollos debate is a little bit dead. Not something we're dealing with in church, but division is something that still strikes the church to this day. When our political allegiances become of greater significance to us than our allegiance to King Jesus, say it this way, Pew Research shows that there's a lot of evidence that within this church, not this church, but the church, that the first lens through which people used to see the world was their relationship with Jesus and the teachings of the Bible, and that their political views would flow from that. But more and more, we live in a society where people pick their political views, and it becomes the first lens through which they view the world, and then they pick their church depending upon their political view. When we hold that in the wrong order, when our first allegiance might be to our politic, it is easy for the church to be divided. When we see conflict between people in the local church, and we pick a side, a who's right and a who's wrong, and come to that person's side instead of working towards the goal of biblical reconciliation within the body, it's easy for the church to be divided. Oftentimes in the church, we all have our own preferences, worship styles, church policies, programs that we want to see or not see, the color of the walls or the carpet on the floor. When those preferences outweigh our unity around a common mission under the kingship of Jesus, it's really easy for the church to be divided. And when we are divided, this sacred thing that the Lord is creating, this holy body that the Lord Jesus gave himself in order to create, it loses its templeness. It becomes tarnished. It loses its ability to do the things that the temple of the Lord is supposed to do. When we're divided, it's really hard to us to point to people in the world who don't know Jesus and say, look at the glory and the majesty of our God, because they look at the way that we treat each other. And so how do we avoid division? It's interesting. It's the same lesson that Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar have both learned over the last 2 chapters. It's humility. It's humility. If you read the rest of this chapter, Paul is going to point out which one of you thinks that you are wise in your own eyes. As he talks about this division in the church, there are some of you that are thinking you are so wise that you're unwilling to bend to the other, and the division grows deeper. But if we live in humility towards one another, disharmony, disunity, and division flee. I think about the example of Jesus himself. When Jesus goes to the cross, this ultimate example of humility. Jesus is no longer concerned with who he thinks should be king. He's laid whatever politic he might have to the side, and Jesus is surrendering himself. The one true king surrenders himself so that we might have life in him. When Jesus goes to the cross, and so often when we're in conflict, we want to say who's right and who is wrong. When Jesus goes to the cross, it's actually the opposite. Jesus realizes who is in the wrong, and he goes to the cross in their place. This ultimate act of humility. I don't think Jesus preferred the cross. See Jesus praying in the garden that, Lord, if you're willing, take this away from me. And yet somehow our preferences can rule and reign in our hearts in such a ways that we would be divided from one another. But the example of Jesus leads us back again and again and again to a humility that honors one another over ourselves. And when we have that kind of humility, there is hope. There's hope that we can live out this calling that Paul talks about of being a temple for the Lord filled with his Spirit. And so here's the call for today. If pride or stubbornness is causing division among you, If you can recognize that in your life, or you can recognize that in relationship with someone else that's in this room, let's repent and reconcile. Let's do the hard work of reconciling with one another in order that this temple that Jesus is building here would not be tarnished. If the Lord doesn't bring someone to mind, let us do this. Let's simply commit that this is a place where we live in humility in our relationships to one another, and that we're going to overcome division through our humility and reconciling relationships with one another and honor one another above ourselves.